stopping it right there. We'll be continuing that song tomorrow night. That's Nina me, really one of our favorite songs in this world. Shlomo Katz, Rova Chuppah Nigun. Big show tonight. We're doing the double daf so we can get back on schedule. Pages 24 and 25 here in Tractate Moed Katan, the 12th volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, the laws of the intermediate days of festivals. Now we're in a long area where we're relating to the laws of mourning, special laws of mourning and incidents when sages died or lost relatives and how they were treated. Very interesting show tonight. Let's light up the darkness. I'll just say very quickly, the reason we're doing a double daf tonight is because last night Nina and I went, as I mentioned, to a screening of my friend Beth Hawk's film that is opening New York and LA this weekend and 60 more cities next weekend. You know, you go see a friend's film, you hope that it's good enough that you could say something nice. This film blew us away. Fantastic. It's such a pleasure that I can say that my friend Beth nailed it. It's called Breaking Bread, and it's about a food festival in Haifa where Israeli chefs are paired with Arab chefs working together, cooking traditional Arab cuisine. Beautiful message. I mean, it's all about how forget governments and politicians, let the people on the ground relate to each other, and we can go so much further in the ways of peace simply by breaking bread together. The chefs are really interesting, likable people. We had a great time. If it's coming to your city next week, go support Beth's film. You'll love it. It's such a fun film. Breaking Bread. Directed by Beth Hawk. All right, let's get into it. It's a double daf. I don't want to waste any time. You guys are going to enjoy this. All right, here we go. The sages, before Rav Papa said, in the name of Shmuel, a mourner who engaged in sexual relations during his days of mourning is liable to receive the death penalty at the hand of heaven. At the hand of heaven, right? So when we're talking about the death penalty at the hand of heaven, sounds very serious, but it's not. What that means is there's no penalty imposed by the sages, by the Beis Din, by the earthly court. You know, we leave it in the hands of heaven to administer punishment or not as heaven sees fit. Really, they're making the point that, the mourner should not be having sex during the 7 days. Rav Papa said to them, it was said that sexual relations are prohibited, but not that the offender is guilty of a capital crime. And the ruling was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and not in the name of Shmuel. And if you heard a statement on this issue in the name of Shmuel, then this is what you heard. Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi said that Shmuel said, a mourner who did not let his hair grow wild and did not rend his garments is liable to receive the death penalty at the hand of heaven. As it is stated following the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron who died in the wilderness. Leviticus 10:6, let not the hair of your heads go loose, neither tear your clothes, that you not die. In other words, Aaron, who was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and his surviving sons, who are the priests, they were not permitted to mourn for Aaron's older sons, Nadav and Avihu, in the way that the rest of us would mourn in such a situation. Why? Because they had to serve the nation and bring offerings on behalf of the nation, and there were no other priests at that time to bring those offerings. So if they, sort of didn't go to work, because that's what a mourner is supposed to do, not go to work, let his hair grow, etc., then nobody would be bringing offerings on behalf of the nation. So the priests have that much, much higher calling, higher obligations. But from what they are not allowed to do, we learn that's what we must do as mourners. Rafram Bar Papa said a sage taught an Evel Rabbati, a separate tractate devoted to the laws of mourning. A mourner is prohibited from engaging in sexual relations during his days of mourning. There was an incident with one who engaged in sexual relations during his days of mourning, and he was punished, for after his death, pigs dragged away his corpse. Shmuel offered a mnemonic device with regard to the observance of mourning rites on Shabbos. We started to talk about this before. We'll continue now. as we've learned, if you're in your Shiva, your 7 days of mourning for a close relative, Shabbos is going to fall on one of those days. Does Shabbos interrupt the Shiva and stop it the way that a festival does? No. It counts as one of the 7 days, but you don't do all of the mourning practices that you do on the other 6 days, because in deference to Shabbos, which is a day when we're commanded to rejoice, we sort of interrupt most of the mourning practices. But in private, you still are a mourner, and you do some things of your mourning that you can only do in private. So some of them are required of the mourner and some of them are optional. And this is explained. Uncovering the head, i.e. removing the head covering that's usually worn by a mourner, reversing the tear to the back. You've torn your clothing. Now you put that in back. This is something you do on Shabbos. And standing the bed upright. We don't do this anymore, but in ancient times, they would turn the bed over and sleep with the mattress near the floor. On Shabbos, they would turn it back, right side up. So those are all obligatory for the mourner to uphold the honor of Shabbos. However, wearing shoes, engaging in sexual relations, and washing one's hands and feet in hot water in the evening are optional activities on Shabbos. If a mourner wishes to refrain from doing these things, he may do so. And Rav said uncovering the head is also an optional activity. And now we're not talking about wearing a kippah, covering your head, but rather that in ancient times the mourner would wrap himself, much as Arabs wrap themselves today. And they're even giving the example of an Ishmaelite head covering, face covering. A mourner would do that, but on Shabbos he would unwrap. And the Gemara asks, according to Shmuel, what is different about wearing shoes that it is optional? And his reasoning, presumably, is that not everyone wears shoes at all times, and therefore not wearing shoes will not be perceived by others as a sign of mourning, right? So the mourner doesn't wear shoes. These days doesn't wear leather shoes. So if then on Shabbos he puts on leather shoes, okay, but maybe it wasn't a clear sign that he was a mourner when he wasn't wearing shoes, because maybe some people are going barefoot anyway. It's a very warm climate over there in the Mideast. And therefore not wearing shoes may not be perceived by others as a sign of mourning. If so, the same thing may be said about uncovering the head, i.e. not everyone uncovers their head at all times, as some people always walk around with their heads wrapped. So how can you tell that they're a mourner just because their heads are wrapped? This too should not be seen as a clear display of mourning, and therefore uncovering one's head should not be treated as optional on Shabbos. The Gemara answers, Shmuel conforms to his standard line of reasoning, for Shmuel said, any tearing of garments, right? We tear a garment when a close relative dies, any tearing of garments that is not done at the time of the most intense grief, i.e. at the time of death, is not considered proper tearing of garments, or when you heard about it. Like maybe you didn't hear about it, but then when you heard about it, that's when you tear your garments. We've seen that teaching before. I think what he's saying here is you were present when someone died, you didn't tear your garment then, and you waited till later to tear it. Now something is lacking, like you didn't do it right. And any wrapping of the head that is not done in the manner of the wrapping of the Ishmaelites, who wrap their heads on all sides, is not considered proper wrapping for a mourner. Since Shmuel requires that a mourner wrap his head in this special manner, one who acts in this way on Shabbos openly displays his mourning, as people do not ordinarily wrap their heads in this manner. And you don't want to be doing that on Shabbos. Any mourning practices that you're going to continue on Shabbos should only be those mourning practices that you do in private. What is this wrapping? Rav Nachman demonstrated the procedure of covering up his face to the sides of his beard, leaving only the center of his face exposed. Sort of like a hajib, but that was something that men and women would do when they were mourners, Jewish mourners in ancient times. Rabbi Yaakov said that Rabbi Yochanan said they taught that a mourner is required to remove his head covering on Shabbos only when he has no shoes on his feet, so that he not appear too obviously to be in mourning. But if he has shoes on his feet, then his shoes prove that he is not observing the rites of mourning on Shabbos. The Gemara returns to Shmuel's statement that any tearing of garments that is not done at the time of the most intense grief and pain is not considered proper tearing of the garments. And the Gemara poses a question. But when they said to Shmuel that Rav had passed away, he tore 12 garments on account of Rav's death and said, the man of whom I was in fear. Now, that sounds a little weird, like he's so broken, right? He's emotionally broken and he's tearing all these garments as a sign of intense grief because he lost his teacher. And how does he describe his teacher? The man of whom I was afraid. But that's because this word yireh in Hebrew is probably better translated as awe, right? Fear, but of the kind of fear that is awe, right? So he was in awe of his colleague and his teacher, Rav. So when they said to Shmuel that Rav had passed away, he ripped 12 garments on account of him and said, the man of whom I was in awe, owing to his great learning, has gone and died. Similarly, when they told Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Hanina had passed away, he tore 13 expensive wool garments on account of Rabbi Hanina's death, and he said that the man of whom I was in awe has gone. When each of these sages received the news that their distinguished colleague had died, it was no longer the time of the most intense grief, i.e. the time of death, and yet they tore their garments, not just one garment, but all their garments. And the Gemara answers, the sages are different. Since their teachings are mentioned all the time, every time they are mentioned is like the time of most intense grief, as the pain over their death is once again renewed. And Rav and Bar Ada said to Rava, your student Rav Amram said that it is taught in a baraisa as follows: for all 7 days of mourning, a mourner must keep the tear in his garment before him so that it will be seen. Right? When your close relative dies and you're right there, I remember when my grandmother died, I was at her bedside, I've told that story many times. And right away, my mother, I think she had a scissors nearby, or she just tore with her hands. I think she had a scissor and then tore. I was wearing a white pocket t-shirt. I remember that. And she tore my t-shirt, and she did the same for my brother, and she did the same for herself, right? And then all through the Shiva, you wear that garment that you were wearing when you were present at the death or heard about the death. And then you wear that garment all through the Shiva, and you wear it so that the tear is in front, so people can see that you've torn your garment. On Shabbos, you're going to turn the garment around out of respect to Shabbos. Where am I? For all 7 days of mourning, a mourner must keep the tear in his garment before him so that it will be seen. And if he comes to change clothing, he changes and rips the new garment. On Shabbos, he turns the tear to his back. And if he comes to change clothing, he changes but does not tear the second garment. And from here, it seems that there is an obligation to tear garments during the entire week of mourning, right? If you change your clothing, like it just got too filthy to keep wearing it for the whole week, okay, so you could put on a new shirt, but you have to rip that one too. But now you're ripping a garment, definitely not at the time of the most intense mourning, which is right after it happened. So it seems like we do tear garments, even not at the moment of the most intense mourning, most intense grief. And the Gemara answers, when that baraisa is taught, that you would, change garments and tear the second garment during that Shiva, it is referring to the specific case of tearing one's garment in honor of his father or mother. Owing to the special honor due to one's parents, it is inappropriate for the child to wear any garment that is not torn during the Shiva. Consequently, if he changes clothing, he must tear the new garment, even if it is no longer the most intense time of grief. But if it was one of the other 5 relatives, spouse, sibling, or child, you would not tear a second garment. And the Gemara asks, those additional tears that are made in honor of one's father or mother, may they be properly mended at the end of the son's period of mourning, or may they not be mended? We already know that the first garment you tore when you lost a parent, God forbid, you never repair that garment. Well, what if you tore a second garment during that week? Do we have the same rule for the second garment? And the Gemara answers, they disagree about this issue. The father of Rav Oshaya and Bar Kapara. One said they may not be mended, and the other said they may be mended. And the Gemara comments conclude that it was Rav Oshaya's father who said that such tears may not be properly mended, for Rav Oshaya said such tears may not be properly mended. From whom did he hear this law? Was it not from his father? But the Gemara rejects this argument. No, this cannot be offered as a proof, or perhaps he heard it from Bar Kapara, who was his teacher. Rava said a mourner may walk about his house in a torn robe on Shabbos, since he is not doing so in public. It was related that Abaye found Rav Yosef walking back and forth in his house on Shabbos when he was in mourning, with a scarf spread over his head in the manner of a mourner. And he said to him, Master, do you not maintain that there is no mourning on Shabbos? And he said to him, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said, matters that are in private apply. And so when one is in his house, he must observe the rites of mourning even on Shabbos, and that is the law. The Mishnah taught, Rabbi Eliezer says, since the temple was destroyed, Shavuos is like Shabbos. Right? Now we've learned that festivals interrupt the Shiva. This tractate that we're reading is Moed Katan, the intermediate days of festivals. That's Passover and Sukkot, which have intermediate days. Shavuos is a one-day holiday in Israel, two-day holiday outside of Israel. Does it, if somebody dies, 2 days before Shavuos, then comes Shavuos, it's a festival, but it's not a week-long festival. Does it interrupt the Shiva the way that Pesach, Passover, and Sukkot do? So says Rabbi Eliezer, since the temple was destroyed, Shavuos is like Shabbos with regard to mourning. That would indicate that you reduce your mourning practices just like you would on Shabbos, but it doesn't stop the Shiva. You continue the Shiva through Shabbos and through Shavuos, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabban Gamliel says, even Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are considered like festivals. Those are also not week-long holidays, right? Rosh Hashanah is 2 days even in Israel. Yom Kippur is 1 day even outside of Israel. And they are considered like festivals that do interrupt the Shiva. And the Gemara comments that Rav Gidel Bar Menashe said, that Shmuel said, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel. And some teach this ruling of Rav Gidel Bar Menashe as referring to the following case. It is taught in a baraisa, within the first 30 days after birth, an infant that dies is taken out for burial in one's bosom. That is to say, he is carried to his grave in one's arms, not in a coffin. And he is buried by one woman and 2 men, there being no need for a minyan. You don't need a quorum of 10 men. But he should not be taken out by 1 man and 2 women, because it is prohibited for 1 man to seclude himself with 2 women. Now we're on the B side of page 24. And recall, tragically, right, we live in a different time, medically speaking, than the ancients, right? I mean, losing babies back then was just all too common. I mean, there were just so many different conditions that they didn't have medical treatment for. So, take it with a grain of salt. The practices today for losing a child are going to be different than ancient times, but even so, there's distinctions that we're about to read. Abba Shaul says, the infant may be taken out even by 1 man and 2 women, for there is no concern with regard to seclusion, that a man and a woman should not be secluded together if they're not married. A man and 2 women should not be secluded together if they're not married. Back then, you could have multiple wives. But Abba Shaul says, we're not concerned about that. They're taking a baby out to be buried. Like, we're really not concerned that they're going to behave inappropriately. And for such an infant, people do not stand in line to offer their condolences to the mourners, as is ordinarily done after a burial, nor do others recite over him the mourner's blessing, which is recited in the courtyard of the graveyard after the burial, nor is the usual formula for the consolation of mourners recited during the 7 days of mourning. A 30-day-old infant that dies is taken out for burial in a coffin. Rabbi Yehuda says not in a small coffin that is carried on one's shoulder, but rather in a coffin that is carried in the arms of 2 people. And for such an infant, people stand in line to offer their condolences to the mourners. And others recite the mourner's blessing at the cemetery, and people recite the consolation of mourners during the week of mourning. A 12-month-old infant is taken out for burial on a bier, B-I-E-R, just as an adult is. Rabbi Akiva says this law applies if the infant that dies is 1 year old and his limbs are like those of a 2-year-old, so that he looks older. Or if he's a 2-year-old and his limbs are like those of a 1-year-old, only then he is taken out on a bier. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, For one that is taken out on a beer, the public should grieve. For one that is not taken out on a beer, the public should not grieve. You start to think about this, the whole community comes together and supports the people who are in grief. I mean, I described last week this, I went to the Shiva house this morning for this friend of mine who lost his wife in a car accident last week. And I mean, you couldn't get into the Shiva house for morning prayers today. There were so many people who came to support him. But perhaps when parents lose, a stillborn or a newborn, a little baby, maybe they don't want that. Maybe they would rather just have a more private, dealing with their grief in a more private way, and that might be being acknowledged here. And what is the status of deceased infants with regard to eulogizing them? Giving a public speech meant to bring the crowd, the audience, to tears. Rabbi Meir said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, the children of the poor are eulogized from the age of 3, whereas the children of the wealthy are eulogized from the age of 5. This is actually priority is being given to poor children over wealthy children, right? The child of wealthy parents who dies at the age of 1, 2, 3, or 4 years old, no eulogy is given. But the poor child who's 3 or 4 years old or above is eulogized. And what is the difference? This is because a child is the sole source of joy for the poor. And so the pain and grief of the poor over the death of a child is greater than that of the wealthy. I mean, who can say the relative pain of parents losing a child? But here's the law from ancient times. And Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, the children of the poor are eulogized from the age of 5, whereas the children of the wealthy are eulogized from the age of 6. And the children of the elderly are treated like the children of the poor, for the death of a child is particularly painful for an older person. We think about he is the child of my old age, right? So it's a little bit like Jacob and how he felt about Joseph and then Binyamin. Rav Gidel Bar Menashe said that Rav said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who stated in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Anani Bar Sasson taught at the entrance to the house of the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, if one suffered the loss of a close relative shortly before the festival of Shavuos, his 1 day of mourning before Shavuos and Shavuos itself count together as 14 days, right? So this idea is Shavuos is going to count like a whole festival. So I'm going to skip some paragraphs now, but I'll just give you the law, the halacha. One who observed mourning practices for at least 1 day before Shavuos is considered as though he observed mourning for 7 days. And Shavuos itself is counted as another 7 days. Therefore, after the festival, he has only 16 days of mourning left until he reaches the Shloshime, the 30-day count, right? So the 30 days is shrunk to 18, basically. And the second day of the festival that is observed in the diaspora is included in this number in accordance with the opinions of Rabbi Nani Bar Sasson and Rabbi Oshai. That's the modern law. It still applies. One who did not bring the festival peace offerings on Shavuos may bring them for an additional 6 days after the festival and thereby fulfill his obligation. That's when the temple is standing. And that's why we have this sense of Shavuos is like a 7-day festival, even though it's only a 1-day festival in Israel. 1 day before Rosh Hashanah, if one observed mourning practices for a deceased relative for even an hour before Rosh Hashanah, then Rosh Hashanah cancels the Shiva. And the 30-day period of mourning is canceled by Yom Kippur, and one may cut his hair on the day before Yom Kippur in accordance with the opinion of Rav Papa. With respect to Sukkot, if one observed mourning for a short time before the festival of Sukkot, it is considered to be 7 days of mourning. The festival itself counts as an additional 7 days, and Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, also counts as a full 7 days. Therefore, he needs to complete only 9 days of mourning after the festival in order to finish his 30-day period of mourning. In the diaspora, Simchas Torah counts as 1 day toward this number. God forbid you're ever in that situation. You're definitely going to consult with your rabbi about the nuances of all these laws. And that brings us to Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Moed Katan. We're right at the end of page 24. Mishnah number 5, mourners do not tear their garments during Hol HaMoed, the intermediate days of a festival, and do not remove their garments from their shoulders, which is a practice we don't do now, but we used to do, I think, for parents and for Torah scholars, the death of Torah scholars in ancient times. And others do not provide them with a meal after the burial, except for close relatives of the deceased, if it happens during the intermediate days of the festival. And the consolers provide the first meal after the burial only while the mourner is sitting on an upright bed and not on one that is overturned, meaning you don't overturn your beds during the festival. There's a death then. What is the law about this? One may tear his garment over a death during the intermediate days of the festival, only when tearing the garment is required according to the law. And some disagree and say that one may not tear garments at all during the intermediate days of the festival. And it is the Ashkenazic custom for one to tear his garments during the intermediate days of the festival, but only when mourning for his father or mother, not for a spouse, sibling, or child. When mourning any other relatives, one tears his garments after the festival ends. However, in Poland, it was customary to tear one's garments when mourning all relatives. The Sephardic communities of Jerusalem, Izmir, and Thessalonica had a similar custom to the Ashkenazic one, the Northern European Jewish custom. However, every place should act in accordance with the local custom there. How are you going to know what the local custom is? Consult your rabbi. The Gemara on Mishnah number 5. Now we're on page 25a. The Mishnah teaches that only the relatives of the deceased tear their clothes. The Gemara asks, during the intermediate days of the festival, and is this the case even if the deceased was a Torah scholar? But isn't it taught otherwise in the Baraisa? When a Torah scholar dies, everyone is his relative. The Gemara clarifies, does it enter your mind to say that everyone is his relative? Rather, this Baraisa should be understood like this. Everyone is considered to be like his relative in the sense that everyone tears his garment in anguish over him, and everyone bears his shoulder over him in mourning, and everyone eats the mourner's meal over him in the public square, as mourners do. The death of a Torah scholar is a personal loss for every Jew. And you have to treat it that way. So why is the Mishnah limited to only relatives? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary for the Mishnah to teach this halacha in a case where the deceased is not a Torah scholar. And the Gemara asks, and if the deceased was an upright person who feared heaven and performed good deeds, then aren't all those present at his death obligated to tear their garments over his death? Right? So what they're saying is, if you're present when someone dies, when you're a Jew and a Jew dies in front of you, and he's not, if he was your relative, obviously you have to tear your garment. If he's a Torah scholar, you have to tear your garment. If he's just your fellow Jew, and he's a righteous Jew, right? He's an observant Jew. He fears heaven, right? He does Torah, he learns Torah, does mitzvahs. Do you need to tear your garment over him? That's the question being asked. As it is taught in a Baraisa, for what reason do a person's sons and daughters die when they are young? They die so that he will cry and mourn over the death of an upright person. What's implied here is that, yes, you should tear your clothing when any upright person, or any upright Jew in this case, dies in front of you. And if you don't, you may be stricken with some kind of a terrible punishment later, like then you will tear your clothes over an upright person, because when a child dies, obviously it's an upright person, never had the chance to become a sinner. And if it's your child, you would tear your clothing over him. So they're using hyperbole in a sense to say, yeah, you tear your garment when your fellow Jews, a righteous person, dies in front of you. Yeah, you tear your garment. Don't sort of tempt heaven to teach you a lesson later in a tough way. And the Gemara questions the formulation. They die so that he will cry and mourn? Is security, i.e. his children, taken from him in advance to ensure that in the future he will mourn over the death of an upright person Rather, the Baraisa means as follows. His children died because he did not cry or mourn over an upright person who died. As with regard to anyone who cries and mourns over an upright person who died, they forgive him for all his transgressions because of the honor he accorded to the deceased. Not only should you, lest some terrible thing happen to you in the future, but when you really grieve over the loss of your fellow Jew and tear your clothing over him in your grief, your own sins are forgiven. There's something to remember. And the Gemara answers, rather, the Mishna is referring only to one who was not an upright person. Do you tear your clothing over somebody who's not an upright person? What's the law here? When an upright person dies, one tears his garment between the time of death and burial as a sign of mourning. Who is an upright person? One who is not suspected of committing grave sins or avoiding performance of any mitzvah, even if he is not knowledgeable in Torah. And some say that a person does not fall into this category unless he is well known for acts of kindness. Torah scholars are not required to tear their garments over such a person, however. Some Torah scholars are strict, and they do tear their garments nevertheless. Others say that only one who is present at the time of the departure of the soul is required to tear his garment and mourn over him in every case. It is the accepted practice to be lenient and not tear one's garment, but that's a leniency. So if you are so moved and you are present at a death, you may tear your garment over that person. The Gemara, but you're not obligated. The Gemara challenges, but if one was standing there at the time of the soul's departure, i.e. at the time of death, he is obligated to tear his clothes. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, one who stands over the deceased at the time of the soul's departure is obligated to tear his clothes. Does it say anything about being a righteous person? Just you're there when a fellow Jew dies. To what may this be likened? To a Torah scroll that is burned, for which anyone present is obligated to tear his clothes. If you see a Torah scroll destroyed, you have to tear your clothes over that. How much more over a human being who's taken? And the Gemara answers, the Mishna must be referring to a person who was not standing there at the time of the soul's departure, but who heard that someone who was not a close relative died, and the deceased was neither a Torah scholar nor an upright person. One who is in the presence of a Jew whose soul departs is required to tear his garment, period. This applies whether the deceased is a man or a woman, but does not apply to a minor who has died unless he has already studied Torah. This applies even if he was not an upright person, and it is known that he occasionally sinned due to his desires or was negligent and did not trouble himself to perform a certain mitzvah. However, one does not tear his garments over one who habitually sins, and even more so over an apostate. Right, so I guess they're distinguishing between, if you see the death happen and it's your fellow Jew, unless he's known to be a wicked Jew, you tear your clothing over him. Different is if you just hear that someone died, right after it happened, do you tear that? That seems to be optional. The Gemara relates that when Rav Safra passed away, the other sages did not tear their garments over him. And they said, well, we did not learn from him, as he did not disseminate his Torah knowledge to the public, like he was a private Torah scholar. Abaye berated them and said to them, is it taught in the Baraisa if one's teacher died? It is taught if a Torah scholar died. And Rav Safra was certainly a Torah scholar. And furthermore, every day his teachings are in our mouths in the study hall, so that even if we did not learn directly from him, we should still be considered his students. The other sages thought that what was done was done. They didn't tear their clothes at the time that they heard of Rav Safra's death, and it was now too late for them to tear their garments. Abaye said to them, we learn, with regard to a Torah scholar, as long as they are engaged in eulogizing him, then people are obligated to tear their garments, even after the time of his death. They then thought to tear their garments immediately. Abaye said to them, it is taught in a Baraisa, a Torah scholar's honor is at the time of his eulogy, and so you should wait until the time of the eulogy before tearing your garment. So they didn't do it right at the death. Do it when the eulogy is happening, when you're moved to tears over what we've lost. That'll be the time to tear your garment. The Gemara relates another incident. When Rav Huna died, they thought to place a Torah scroll on his bier, right? That little platform they're going to carry him out for his funeral. as was commonly done in ancient times after the death of a Torah scholar, right? On his bier, with his corpse being carried out, they placed a Torah scroll so the public would know that it was a Torah scholar who was going out to burial. And this is as if to say that the deceased fulfilled everything written in the scroll. Not just that he was a great Torah teacher, but that this was a person who was a righteous person who fulfilled all the commands of the Torah. How could he do that, right? He's not necessarily a priest. He's not serving in the temple. The temple was destroyed at the time that these guys are talking. But a Torah scholar, a prominent Torah scholar, is one who certainly studied every law in the Torah. And that's why he's credited as if he fulfilled all those laws. Rav Chisda said to them, this is a practice that Rav Huna did not hold by during his lifetime. He didn't think that Torah scrolls should be carried on a bier with a corpse. Now, should we stand up and do it for him when he is dead? When he thought that this shouldn't be done for anyone? Rav Tachlifa said, I myself saw Rav Huna, who wished to sit on his bed, and there was a Torah scroll placed on his bed, and he turned the jug over and placed the Torah scroll on the jug so that he could then sit on the bed. He would not sit on the same level with a Torah scroll. He would always elevate the Torah scroll above him so that he would not be sitting on something that is at the same level as a Torah scroll. From that, we would learn that he wouldn't want to be lying on a platform with a Torah scroll when he's being carried out to his funeral. Even his corpse, he wouldn't want that. Apparently, he holds that it is prohibited to sit on a bed on which a Torah scroll lies. Therefore, it would be inappropriate to lay a Torah scroll next to his body after he died. When they tried to remove his corpse from his house for the burial, the bier, the platform they were going to carry his body on, would not fit through the narrow door. So they thought to lower the bier from the roof. Rav Chisda said to them, this I learned from Rav Huna himself. A scholar's honor is for him to be taken through the main door of the house, not out through the roof. So they then thought to move, but the bier wouldn't fit. So they thought to move him from his bier to a narrower bier so that, I think it's pronounced bier, right? Not buyer, but B-I-E-R. So that it would fit through the door. But Rav Chisda said to them, I learned from him, Rav Huna himself, as follows: a scholar's honor is for him to be taken out on the first bier. As Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, from where is it derived that a scholar's honor is for him to be taken out on the first bier? As it is stated, and they set the ark of God upon a new cart, 2 Samuel 6:3. When they were taking the ark to Jerusalem, King David had it placed back on the cart upon which it had been returned by the Philistines, and a Torah scholar is considered to be similar to the Ark of the Covenant. When they saw that there was nothing else that they could do, they broke the doorway so that they could take him out through the doorway on the first bier on which they placed his corpse. They had to break the door open for his honor. Rabbi Abba opened his eulogy for Rav Huna. Our rabbi, hold on a second, I just want to check. Yeah, Rabbi Abba opened his eulogy for Rav Huna. Our rabbi was worthy that the divine presence should rest upon him, except for the fact that Babylonia caused it not to rest. In other words, it was only because he lived in Babylonia and not in the land of Israel that the divine presence did not rest upon him. Had he lived in Israel, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, would have always been with him. Like there would be an aura of holiness around him. But because he lived in Bavel, in the Babylonian Jewish community, the Shekhinah wouldn't leave Israel to go to Bavel, and that's the only reason he didn't have the Shekhinah around him. Rav Nachman bar Chisda raised an objection against this, and some say that it was Rav Hanan bar Chisda, who said, is it not stated, the word of the Lord came, Chayo Chaya, to Ezekiel the priest, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans, Ezekiel 1:3, thereby implying that a prophet can prophesy outside of the land of Israel. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, will rest on a sufficiently worthy, righteous person, even outside of Israel. Rav Nachman bar Chisda raised that objection. His father tapped him with his sandal, in other words, kicked him, saying to him, what the hell are you doing? You don't interrupt a eulogy to say that the eulogizer has made a mistake of halacha and Jewish legal interpretation. Have I not told you not to trouble everyone with questions in the middle of a eulogy? And the Gemara answers the question, what is the meaning of the doubling of the word came, hayo? It implies that it had already come before. In other words, the reason that the prophet Ezekiel was worthy to have the divine presence rest on him so that he could prophesy even outside of Israel is because the divine presence came to rest on him while he was still in Israel. That's kind of in passing, the Gemara is answering that question. But the bigger point is, yeah, if you're listening to a eulogy and you think that the guy who's speaking is making a mistake of Torah law, perhaps you could tell him later in private, not blurting it out at the funeral. Now, the Gemara relates that when they took Rav Huna there to the land of Israel for burial, they said to Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, Rav Huna has come. And they misunderstood and they thought that Rav Huna had come like he was still alive. They said, when we were there in Babylonia, we did not have strength to lift our heads before him. Now that we have come here, has he come after us? Right? Like they looked up to him so much. And they said to them, his coffin has come. And Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi went out to meet the funeral procession. Rabbi Illa and Rabbi Hanina did not go out. And some say that Rabbi Illa went out, but Rabbi Hanina did not go out. And the Gemara asks, so in other words, Rav Huna died in Babylonia, and like people do still today, he wanted to be buried in Israel, so they transported the corpse all the way to Israel. Today, as we've seen recently, somebody could die in Los Angeles and be buried in Israel tomorrow because we have airplanes. But back then, somebody could die in the Babylonian Jewish community, and by the time he's buried in Israel, many days have passed, maybe weeks, maybe months. So it's not the immediate, funeral procession like that it just happened. So those who are in the study hall, they see that people are walking by carrying a corpse, right? But it's not a funeral procession. It's more like moving the bones to another location. So those who went out, what is the reason that they went? As it is taught in a Baraisa, when a coffin is passing from place to place, the people stand in a line to show respect for the deceased, and they recite the mourner's blessing and the consolation of the mourners over it. Those who did not go out, what is the reason they did not? As it is taught in a different Baraisa, when a coffin is passing from place to place, they do not stand in a line to show respect for the deceased, and they do not recite the mourner's blessing or the consolation of mourners for him. So we have two Baraisas that directly contradict each other. Both are talking about not a funeral procession for somebody that just died, but, after some time has passed, that a coffin is being transported from one place to another, and it happens to pass in front of the study hall. What do? The Gemara asks, so if so, these two statements of the Tanaim contradict each other. And the Gemara answers, La Kash, it is not difficult. Here, in the first case, the Bryce is referring to a case where the skeleton of the deceased is still intact, and the mourning practices would be observed. And there, the Bryce is referring to a case where the skeleton of the deceased is no longer intact, and it is not necessary to observe the customs of mourning. Right? Remember that in ancient times, they would bury the body just so that it could decompose, and then later the bones would be moved to the family crypt, as it were. So if the skeleton is still intact, meaning, okay, the person died, and it's like a month or two has passed, that skeleton is still intact, so it's like a funeral, and you treat it like a funeral. But if it's really just relocating the bones much later, and it's just for a regular person, or here even for a prominent person, we don't snap back into the mourning state of being. And the sages of Eretz Yisrael said, where shall we bury him, Rav Huna? They concluded, Rav Huna disseminated Torah to all the people of Israel. And similarly, Rabbi Chia disseminated Torah to the people of Israel. Therefore, let us bury Rav Huna next to Rabbi Chia. And they said, who will take him into Rabbi Chia's burial cave? As few are fit to enter it. So this was understood to be a place where only the righteous could enter. Right? So even to lay a body inside that burial cave, don't come unless you are such a righteous person that you won't endanger yourself by entering this place where only the righteous may enter. Rav Chaga said to them, I will take him into the cave. For I presented my studies before him when I was just 18 years old, never having experienced a seminal emission. And so too I attended to him, and I knew his great deeds. For example, one day, one of the straps of his tefillin turned around, the unpainted side being turned outward, and he observed 40 fasts for this, as he acted negligently, allowing the black side to face inward. What he was saying is that, Rav Huna was such a righteous person. It's crazy, right? Right? Rav Chaga observed that Rav Huna was, or Rabbi Chia. I'm not sure who he's talking about, but he was so righteous that even when his tefillin was just facing the wrong way, okay, it has to face the correct way, but you haven't sinned if it turns the wrong way. And he would impose upon himself fast days, 40 fast days, just for this little, moment of negligence. I mean, he's just saying that guy was a righteous person on a whole other level than the rest of us. And Rav Chaga was able to be in his presence. So now he was able to be in Rabbi Chia's presence and in Rav Huna's presence. Okay, so he can take Rav Huna's body into Rabbi Chia's cave. Rav Chaga took him in. The body of Rabbi Chia's son Yehuda lay buried to the right of Rabbi Chia, his father, and the body of his other son Hizkiah lay to his left. The spirit of Yehuda said to the spirit of Hizkiah, rise from your place, as it is not proper conduct to remain lying when the body of Rav Huna is standing here. When Hizkiah's corpse stood up, right? So Rav Chaga saw that these dead stood up for Rav Huna when he entered, right? Rabbi Chia didn't have to stand up because he's a colleague of Rav Huna at the same level. But his sons are like students to the sages. So out of deference to Rav Huna, the corpses of Hizkiah and Yehuda stood up. Rav Chaga is reporting that he saw this when he took the body into that cave. When Rabbi Chaga saw this, he was frightened by what he saw. And so he stood up Rav Huna's coffin and he went away. And the Gemara comments, and he was not punished or harmed by this pillar of fire because he set up, I skipped something. Hizkiah said, rise from your places. It is not proper conduct to remain lying when the body of Rav Huna is standing there. And when Hizkiah's corpse stood up, a pillar of fire rose with him. When Rabbi Chaga saw this, he was frightened by what he saw. And so he stood up Rav Huna's coffin and went away. And the Gemara comments, and he was not punished or harmed by this pillar of fire because he set up Rav Huna's coffin as protection for himself. Okay. Then there's a couple more incidents like this where they're sort of figuring out how much deference should be given to a couple of sages. Pretty interesting stories. We just don't have time to do everything today. So I'm going to one of these, because we are covering another of these stories, and it's this one. It was related that Rabbi Chanin was a son-in-law in the house of the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. At first, he did not have any children, but he prayed that God have mercy on him, and then he had a child. On the same day that a son was born to him, he himself passed away. A certain eulogizer opened his eulogy for him with the following words: happiness has been turned into sorrow. Joy and suffering have been joined together. At the moment of his happiness, right, when he was finally having a child, he sighed his last dying breath. At the moment he was graced with a son, his own grace was lost. And they named the child Hanan after his father, right? Normally you would never have, my Hebrew name is Yoel ben Avinoam, Yoel the son of Avinoam. You would never name, in most Jewish places, a son after his father. Right? You never hear, God forbid, like Avraham ben Avraham, unless the father died before the son was born. Then you might have an Avraham ben Avraham, and that's what happened in this case of Hanan. The Maharsha writes that the days of celebration over the birth of the child were exactly the same as the days of mourning over the father. The day of Rav Chanin's death was the day that the child was born. The day of his circumcision was on the 7th day of mourning, counting from the first day of the funeral. And the redemption of the firstborn was at the end of the 30-day mourning period for Rav Chanin. When Rabbi Yochanan passed away, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Elazar opened his eulogy for him like this: "Today is as difficult for the Jewish people as the day that the sun set at noon, darkness at noon. As it is written, Amos 8, 9, and 10, and it shall come to pass on that day, says the Lord God, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day, and I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation, and I will bring up sackcloth upon all loins and baldness upon every head, and I will make it as the mourning for an only son, and its end like a bitter day." Now, we've seen before that from those verses, we learn some of the laws of mourning. But here the eulogizer was saying that, God was warning the Jewish people through his prophet Amos that if you don't straighten out, I will give you what to mourn over. But when we lose certain lights of the generation, it's like God has struck us with those kinds of curses. It's not the same, obviously, but our grief is great. And Rabbi Yochanan said this was the day on which King Josiah was killed. 2 Chronicles 35, 20 through 24. And this demonstrates that the most righteous person of the generation is described like the sun in the sky being darkened when that person dies. It was further related, I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. It was further related that when Rabbi Yochanan passed away, Rabbi Ami sat in mourning for him for 7 days and for 30 days as though he had lost a close relative. Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba, said when Rabbi Ami died, he did on his own, but this practice does not reflect the law. For Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that, Rabbi Yochanan said as follows: "Even for the death of his teacher who taught him wisdom, one sits in mourning for him for only 1 day and no more." What is the law about losing your teacher? One tears all of his garments in mourning when his primary Torah teacher dies. Similarly, a convert tears his garments over the death of the rabbi who accepted him as a convert. Some say that he tears only 1 handbreadth of his garment, but he may never mend this tear. In addition, he should practice all the customs of mourning for a portion of the day on the day of the death or the day on which he receives the news of the death. But it's like when you hear the death of a relative more than 30 days after it happened. You don't do a 7-day Shiva when you lose your teacher, but you're a full mourner for a day, or at least a part of a day. The Gemara tells of another incident about a eulogy. When Rabbi Zera died, a certain eulogizer opened his eulogy for him, saying, "The land of Shinar conceived and gave birth to him, as he was originally Babylonian. But the land of beauty, in other words, the land of Israel, raised the darling of Babylonia, as he later moved to the land of Israel, and he grew up there. Woe to her," said Rakat, a poetic name for Tiberias, "for her dearest vessel has been lost." And the Gemara continues to discuss the death of the righteous. When Rabbi Abahu passed away, the pillars of Caesarea, his city, ran with water, as if they were shedding tears over him. When Rabbi Yosef passed away, the gutters of Tzipori, his city, flowed with blood. When Rabbi Yaakov passed away, the stars were visible during the day, like the sky darkened for him. When Rabbi Asi passed away, all the trees were uprooted in a storm. When Rabbi Chia passed away, fiery stones fell from the sky. When Rabbi Ben Nachum, the son of Rabbi Yosef, passed away, the faces of the statues became smooth, as if they had been smoothed with the plasterer's trowel. That's what I've got for us today. Obviously here we're reading the words of the sages describing when what happens when other sages die, how they must be mourned, and how even natural phenomena, the sky, the trees, the rivers, the hills, the mountains, all mourn, expressively mourn for one who was lost. And it's because, according to Judaism, and particularly according to these sages, what is our purpose? What is our mission in this world as the Jewish people? It's to turn this place, this world, this physical world that we live into a home for God, right? We want to, tikkun olam means to repair the world. But what does that mean? It means to change the world into such a place that God would be comfortable residing here among us, right? God is so elevated and holy I mean, we're inside God. God feels everything that we do, but God doesn't choose to, make his presence felt here because there's so much ugliness in the world, so much pain and suffering that we cause each other. So much idolatry, tragically, is going on in the world. But the people who are working toward making the world, a home fit for God, are worthy of great respect for that. And one who is, teaching Torah so that everyone understands what it means to fulfill the law as the Torah spells it out, so that we can repair the world in a worthy way. They are the leading lights of the generation, and that's why we mourn when they are taken from us, and mourn in a profound way. All right, let's go to questions or comments on this double daf 24 and 25 in Tractate Moed Katan. Norman Green. In fact, my father died on the 11th of Nisan, so that would be 3 days before Passover, or 4 days before Passover, but we really start on the 14th in the afternoon, a few years ago, and we applied the rules for calculating the Shiva and the Shloshime just as you have stated. So the Passover interrupted the Shiva, right? So, but the days before Passover count as 7 days. Then Passover counts as 7 days, and they've already counted, right, 14 days toward the 30-day Shloshime, just as we said tonight. That's how Norman did. So you see it's in practice in real life. Thank you, Norman. And may your father's memory always be for a blessing. Sharon, if one does not witness the time of death, but was the first to come upon the dead person, does that also warrant tearing of one's garment? Again, ask a rabbi, but I think so, right? Please report back and let me know, but it seems to me like, yeah, that's like the time of death. You're the first to discover. I mean, that's so intense. And it's funny you mentioned that because I just had, it's weird how things happen in bunches. And on Friday, somebody who does work around our house on a regular basis kind of reached out to him, and his kind of young apprentice answered the phone and said, "Yes, my mentor died," and I didn't know. And then he related to me that the guy didn't have family, and so he died home alone. And it was his apprentice that found him a few days later, and it was very intense, as you can imagine, for this young apprentice who will now be doing the work. So I would imagine that okay, he died a few days earlier, but that pain is so present for the one who finds the body. So I'm not sure about the exact laws of that. Ask a rabbi, but may we never have to deal with something like that. Bill. It is pronounced beer. Thank you. B-I-E-R. When we carry out a body, it's pronounced beer. And this I know, says Bill, because Sir Terry Pratchett of blessed memory had the bar used by the undead in his Discworld fantasy novels named Beers in a direct pun on Cheers. Thank you, Bill. And finally, Sharon... Ray, a difference in the place where the righteous are buried. Doesn't it say in Ecclesiastes that all are the same in death? Yes. And yet, but here we have this story, right? That there was a cave that only, very righteous people would be allowed to be buried in, or even to enter to do the burial. And we certainly see that tzaddikim, right, like saintly leaders of the generation, they get buried in the same cemetery with other people. That's true, and it's really just the marker on the place of rest, that is made more prominent. And some will even have, like if you go to Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, but you visit him in Uman. So it's like they built a synagogue over his final resting place so that people could daven and be close to him there. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but it's an important point that you're making, Sharon, and thank you. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 26. But I'll just repeat what Joel, my friend Joel, tragically lost his wife last week, said. to me today, it's enough. It's enough with the deaths. It's enough with losing people. We need Mashiach now so that, the era of death and dying and mourning ends. Amen.